season for mock drafts. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Thursday, December 12th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, we are recapping our first head-to-head points mock draft of the offseason. It's our second mock overall, but also the first one we've done since October 30th. So many things have changed, and we will highlight a lot of those differences. We also have some moves that we still need to talk about. This has been a very eventful week. Lots going on with the winter meetings, but we've got Nathan Eovaldi back to the Rangers. Jake Burger got traded. Spencer Hortwitz got moved again after we did that emergency podcast. So let's just...
We did an emergency podcast for Spencer Hortwitz?
Exactly.
This guy's a bigger deal than I thought.
Let's get the news out of the way, and then we'll jump into that mock draft. We did an emergency podcast for Garrett Crochet as well. It was almost 30 minutes long. I feel like we covered every single aspect of it. So make sure to check that out.
A lot going on there.
Yeah, there is. Turns out the Rangers were looking to beef up their lineup because they acquired Jake Burger from the Marlins in exchange for three prospects, Ashedri Vargas, Max Acosta, and Brian Mendoza. So Burger, we know, took a step back this season, but he was still useful, mostly in the second half. He had 29 home runs. 760 OPS. He still hits the ball very hard. Scott, how does everything work out here for the Rangers? How does everything fit? Because Roster Resource has Burger at DH. Nathaniel Lowe is still there at first base. They have a crowded outfield. Your thoughts?
Well, that is the question. How does everything fit? Clearly, the Rangers see a fit there, but is it a fit that's going to keep him fantasy relevant? Because he's the sort of player who could lose fantasy relevance very easily. He really just brings one thing to the table, the big power. Not a great on-base guy, not a great defender. So he had an easy time getting into the White Sox lineup and the Marlins lineup. They could use anything. It halfway decent in their lineup. The Rangers, it's a different story. I think he could be partially a fallback option if Josh Young gets hurt again at third base. He could be partially a platoon partner with Nathaniel Lowe at first base. He could be a part-time DH for those days they want to get Leody Taveras out of the lineup. But is he going to get all the way to full-time at-bats between those three different roles? Because if he's anything less than that, probably not that relevant in 12-team leagues anymore. So even though it's a better lineup, it's a better venue, I actually think Jake Burger loses value with his deal. I dropped him a couple spots in both my first base rankings and third base rankings. First base, he dropped behind Ryan Mountcastle and Paul Goldschmidt for me. Third base behind Nolan Arenado and his new teammate, Josh Young.
And I will just say, like, this is one that might just be like saving the fantasy world because
from itself.
Jake Burger's been going like 127 overall in the NFC drafts that have happened. It might be lower lately, but that is the overall number, and that is way too high, I think. I don't know, Scott, where you have him ranked, but yeah, even in December, it was 126. He's been right now, he's in the 191 spot for me. I moved him down a little bit, but he was never as high as his ADP for me.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Before the trade, I had him 171.
Yeah.
So I said I moved him behind those guys. The truth is, I'm planning to move him behind those guys. My rankings aren't public yet, so I can pretend like I already did it. Yeah.
I wonder if that ADP is just a little bit of a panic about there's just not that much power in the middle rounds of drafts. So maybe people look at Burger and think, he still should be a 30 home run hitter. And it's interesting, Scott, that you think, Leody Taveras could still play in this move. And I'm sure he'll get some at-bats. But I kind of viewed this as Burger is just the team's DH. And they'll roll with Langford, Evan Carter, Adolis Garcia in the outfield. But you also bring up a good point about there's a lot of injury risk on that team between Josh Young and Evan Carter coming back from a back injury and Adolis Garcia is coming back from a knee injury. So
straight knee injuries too.
Well, I kind of feel like Burger is just going to get full at-bats, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
It could go that way. I think there's no way of predicting it. And they also have Josh Smith, who did a lot of nice things for them last year and currently doesn't have a lineup spot. I suspect Berger will play more than Leody Taveras, but if he gets only 450 at bats,
that's a huge problem if that happens.
Right. That's still a lot of playing time, but it's not enough to keep him mattering in 12-team leagues.
As you mentioned, you pointed out, I just wanted to put some numbers on it. It's a huge upgrade for Jake Berger. Rangers Globe Life Field, 5th for home run park factor. The Marlins Lone Depot Park is 22nd, and he's going from a team that scored the 27th most runs in baseball to the Rangers, who were 18th. And of course, they were all the way up at 3rd in 2023. So
were the Marlins really 27th in runs?
Yes.
That feels way too high. That feels at least 2 spots too high.
Yeah, it surprised me a little bit too.
I noticed you didn't say 3.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, the White Sox were historically bad, but yeah, they were. Wow, tough look for the Rays and Angels.
Mm-hmm. Last point on the Marlins side of things, with Jake Berger gone, I assume Davison De Los Santos gets a chance to DH right from the jump. Feels that way.
I would hope so. I mean, Peter Bendix has had a couple of quotes this offseason that have been like pretty cagey about his chances of playing every day. Augustin Ramirez, a couple of the other guys that they acquired. I would assume he's got to play every day, but it might be, tenuous enough that if he has a bad spring, it might give them cause to send him back down. Davis de Los Santos still only 22, so it's not a Kyle Stowers where they kind of need to see what they have right now.
Let's stick with the Rangers and talk about their pitching, because Nathan Eovaldi is headed back to the team on a 3-year, $75 million deal. And coming off another solid season, 3.80 ERA, 1.11 WHIP, got to 170 2/3 innings. That was his most since 2021. Swinging strike rate was actually awesome, 13%. That was 12th highest among qualified starting pitchers. The early ADP for Eovaldi is 206. He's going just ahead of Mackenzie Gore, Bowden Francis, Tanner Houck, and Spencer Arrighetti. Thoughts on the price tag for Nathan Eovaldi there?
It feels fine. If anything, I could go a couple rounds ahead. He's 182 in my rankings right now in Roto, so I have no problem with him at that price. He's pretty much a known quantity, and that quantity is good. And, stayed healthy enough to get to 170 innings last year, which is, a relatively big deal for him. He hadn't done that in each of the previous 2 seasons, but he's not a difference maker. He's a nice stabilizer, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. I think maybe a little bit unlucky. The Sierra was at 3.64. Actually, expected ERA was at 3.86. So yeah, maybe he's just kind of in that range.
I mean, the 2 years he just had was the best 2-year stretch of his career.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting.
Mm-hmm.
It was fine, and I think he's pretty safely fine, but he's probably going to have an IL stint. He's probably going to have a stretch where he loses a mile per hour and gets hit really hard. But then those stretches where he's not doing that, he outperforms his overall numbers and pitches deep into games, gets you a nice win total. That's basically Nathan Eovaldi in a nutshell.
All right. We did the Max Fried emergency pod yesterday. We also talked about the Andres Jimenez trade in that podcast. And Jimenez went to the Blue Jays. Spencer Hortwitz came back to Cleveland. And then it turns out that Hortwitz was rerouted to the Pittsburgh Pirates for Josh Hartle, Luis Ortiz, and Michael Kennedy. So Hortwitz seems likely to play first base for the Pirates. So much for Brian Reynolds getting some reps there. And, Scott, typically we don't think PNC is not a great place to hit. 13th in left-handed home run park factor.
It's terrible for right-handers. It's not bad for left-handers, and Horwitz's power is to his pull side. So I don't think the venue's going to drag down his value in any way. I would have rather him played every day in Cleveland, but playing every day in Pittsburgh is still an upgrade from his situation in Toronto. And I think he becomes somebody who's going to be drafted in roto leagues, probably with the extra middle infield and corner infield spot. He'll be eligible at second base, a thin position, and could be a useful source of batting average while still providing some power.
The ADP is going very late for Spencer Hortwitz, 446 over at the NFBC. Scott, let me ask you this. Two hitters that I know have a special place in your heart. Would you rather Spencer Hortwitz or Jonathan Aranda as things stand right now?
Well, it depends how deep the league is. I think Aranda has more upside. So if you're in the sort of league where the incentive in the late rounds is just to get as much upside as you can and figure it out later on the waiver wire, then Aranda. But if you play in like a deep 15-teamer, better off going with Hortwitz since the bats are more likely to be there.
The Rockies signed Thairo Estrada to a one-year deal, and it could be a sneaky move for fantasy. Estrada dealt with a bunch of injuries this year, complete down season. I think he got DFA'd at some point by the Giants, but he finished as a top 125 player in Roto, both 2022 and 2023. A little bit of power, some speed, solid batting average. Assume he'll hit a little bit in Coors Field as well. Chris, any interest here in deeper leagues? Thairo Estrada to the Rockies.
It would have to be a deep categories league. I don't think there's much chance that he matters for head-to-head points. And look, something that we have fallen victim to in past years is like solid, decent-ish journeyman lands with the Rockies, and we're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, and it usually doesn't work out. Jurickson Profar would be a pretty prime example of that in the past couple of years. It's not a cure-all.
It seems weird that it doesn't work out, right? Because it used to work out. Like, go back 15, 20 years. That was a formula for finding an instant stud in fantasy. And I know since then they brought in the humidors and they made some changes, but it still plays as a very BABIP boosting park.
It's the best hitter's park in baseball still, by far. It's not even close. I think the problem is just even play. Like, the Rockies scored about a half a run more than the Rays did last year, who were the second worst offense in the league. The Rockies probably had a worse offense than the Rays, right? Like, it's just that Coors Field. So like the Rockies finishing like they were like 19th in runs scored last year. That means that they are just a disaster away from Coors Field. And so very low counting stat opportunities outside of Coors Field for half your games. And then like you still have to hit at Coors Field. And so like,
well, with Thairo Estrada, though, he was a pretty valuable asset in 2022 and 23. He was like a poor man's Tommy Edman. And he played last season with a wrist injury. So you can totally understand why his numbers cratered. I'm not going to design a draft strategy around Thairo Estrada, but I do think he's worthy of a late round pick in Roto now.
I can see it mattering in Roto. Like, if they let him steal 25 bases, especially that this was a team where two guys stole double digits last year and one of them stole 10. So, I don't know how likely that is, but I don't know. Do the Rockies ever seem like they have a plan? It's not, I don't know if and I say that to say that I don't know if the Rockies said, we're not going to run. It's just like, if you wanted to run, you could run. And Brenton Doyle was the only one who wanted to run last year is probably the answer there. So like, yeah, I could see Thairo Estrada hitting 275 and stealing 25 bases. Yeah.
This won't surprise anybody, but 24 career games in Coors Field for Estrada. He has hit 348 with 4 home runs, 3 steals, and a 971 OPS.
But unfortunately, he doesn't get to face Rockies pitchers.
That is fair. Speaking of the Rockies, Brenton Doyle is expected to be their leadoff man next season. He hit all over the lineup this past year, but did see most of the time batting second and third. So I guess could see even more runs scored next season. Lots of rumors still out there. Trade rumors. The Cubs and the Yankees are trying for Kyle Tucker, and the Red Sox are in contact with the Mariners trying to get a starting pitcher, which is something we spoke about, Chris, and still think it makes a lot of sense for the Red Sox to make another move. Before we hit our first break, we have a pretty awesome announcement here. FBT is a finalist for Best Baseball Podcast in the Sports Podcast Awards, and the winner will be determined by a fan vote. So we need your help. If you're watching on YouTube, scan the QR code or click the link in the episode description. And once you get to the website, you just click the little thumbs up next to FBT, punch in your info, and it's easy as that. help us bring home the hardware. Let's get it done.
Can we lobby this group to do the voting in like March next year? I feel like we'd have a much better chance.
Yeah.
If we were doing this in March, really rally the troops at the biggest moment of the year.
Yeah.
Putting the baseball podcast at a disadvantage.
Yeah, you're not wrong, man. Let's take our first break. When we return, we hop into the head-to-head points mock draft. We'll do that right after this.
If you love football, this is the best time of the year.
This is as big as it gets.
The stuff of absolute dreams.
Welcome back in. Let's recap our first head-to-head points mock draft of the offseason. 12-team head-to-head points league using the CBS scoring format, and all the results are live on the site. I'll put the link in the episode description so you can follow along if you'd like. And I was drafting third, Scott was sixth, and Chris was eighth. As I mentioned, this was our second mock draft, first head-to-head points, but I'm going to start with pointing out some of the biggest differences from that draft that happened on October 30th. And again, that was Roto. This is points. So I think just clearly there was going to be some differences. I'll pull up the draft here for some people watching if you want to see. But the one that a couple that stand out in the first round, Scott, we had Juan Soto. He went second in this draft. He was fourth in Roto. We had Bobby Witt Jr. He fell all the way down to 6. He went to you. So that was great. He went second in the Roto draft. Freddie Freeman went 9th in this one, 22nd in Roto. So maybe just a little overzealous there. And then Paul Skeens went 12th in this draft, 18th in the Roto one. Anything stand out from those four differences? Soto, Bobby Witt, Freeman, and Paul Skeens.
I think Soto and Witt both just represent a little overcorrecting on the
That's
format.
I was going to say the same thing.
Like, obviously, you should adjust for the format. And look, Bobby Witt walks an average amount, has a below average strikeout rate. He's not a guy who is significantly worse in a head-to-head points league, but
He
I
used
will
to
point out, yeah, he used to be.
He used to be, but he's made such strides with the strikeout rate. I don't want to steal what you're about to point out because I think it's the same thing I was about to point out. What was it?
Well, I just Bobby Witt's not going to be this good next year. Probably is the way I would put it. Like, I think he's going to be a good source of batting average. I do not think Bobby Witt is going to hit 332 again. I think I think the Royals as a team are pretty likely to take a step back. So I would certainly take the under on 125 runs, probably the under on 109 RBI.
Okay.
Great player. But I do think, like, just saying, hey, he was third in points last year, I'm not expecting an exact repeat of last year. And I think the ways in which he finished third last year, especially just the bonkers counting stats, I think you should bet on that being a little lower. So, like, him falling to 6, he probably shouldn't fall to 6, but I don't think it's as egregious as Juan Soto going second in a head-to-head points league, which just, I think, should not happen.
Well, what I was going to point out is actually the opposite of what you pointed out. So we're not on the same page.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Fight.
Bobby Witt had more. So yes, Juan Soto we think of as a head-to-head points type of player. Bobby Witt we think of as more of a Roto type of player. Bobby Witt had more head-to-head points per game than Juan Soto last year, when Juan Soto had arguably his career season. So you mentioned there are ways Bobby Witt could lose points next year, but I will point out he only stole 31 bases when he stole 49 the year before. So he could make up a lot of points.
Sure, he could, yeah.
That he loses in other areas just by getting that stolen base total back up. I rank Bobby Witt exactly the same. Really, my top 4 is exactly the same at both points in Roto League. With
same order?
Same order. Actually, I have Judge ahead of Ohtani in points leagues. So Judge, Ohtani, Witt, Soto in points leagues. Ohtani, Judge, Witt, Soto, and Roto. Smaller gap between 3 or 4 in points leagues than in Roto. Soto, a stronger 4. But the actual 4 doesn't change for me.
With Freeman going 9th overall, he averages 3.3 fantasy points per game. I think some people might look at him as a better player in head-to-head points as well. I think he just maybe went a little bit too early in this draft.
Yeah.
So I'm not really putting too much stock into that. And then
he is a better head-to-head points player, good plate discipline, a lot of doubles. But it was it's funny. When I first started this gig, people wouldn't correct enough for head-to-head points leagues versus Roto. You get some real values that way. But now I think, like Chris was saying, it's gone far the other direction. Well, this guy is good in this format, so I'm going to raise him 15 spots, when really you should raise him more like 5.
Paul Skeens went 12th to finish out the first round. He was 18th in that first draft. Do you guys think this is a head-to-head points effect, or is this closer to where he'll actually go in drafts come March?
This is just where he's going. Like I it's hard to say because the drafts that are happening right now are those high stakes leagues that, you know, really do prioritize looking for the overall. And I think people are talking themselves into Paul Skeens being a huge differentiator in that regard, in a way that may not be true for the general population and certainly may not be true for a points league population as well, because I do think as good as he is and as many innings as he pitched last year, he's probably a worse bet for huge volume than Tarek Skubal or Zach Wheeler, or even
it's probably Burns. Like, we're not into Skeens as the number one pitcher, but it makes even less sense in head-to-head points because you rely so much on pitching volume.
I think he will go around 12th in a lot of Roto leagues, but I think it makes less sense in a points league.
All right, let's move on to some other early round differences between this mock and our first one. Jarren Duran went 20th overall in the first one. Scott, you got him all the way down at 30, the middle of round 3. And I actually wanted to take Duran myself, but I started my draft with Aaron Judge and Jackson Chourio. So I didn't want to fill up all 3 outfield spots in a 3 outfielder league. Maybe I should have just tried it out to see how it would have worked out. But I thought that was obviously good value there on Duran, middle of the 3rd round.
Yeah, because his main contribution is stolen bases. I think, again, there's an overcorrection. People think of Duran as, okay, this is a Roto type of player and not so much a points league type of player, but 3.48 points per game last year was Jarren Duran, which was, what's a good comp? Freddie Freeman, who went in round 1, 3.28. So Duran was significantly better on a per game basis than Freeman last year.
And I think similar to what you were saying, Chris, about Bobby Witt, is the most likely scenario is that Jarren Duran takes a step back. I still think he's worthy of like a late 2nd, early 3rd round pick, but he's probably not going to do, 3.5 fantasy points per game again or anything like that. Maybe he does, and he just surprises me. I think another similar player, Scott, where people look at him and they think Roto immediately, and maybe he falls a little bit too far, is Trey Turner, who I took in the early 3rd round at 27th overall, and he went 21st in that first Roto mock. So does Trey Turner in the early 3rd make sense? Do you think he should go higher in a points league? Or?
I'm not even sure Trey Turner is like significantly better in a Roto league than a points league anymore.
Yeah.
This has been going on with Trey Turner for years.
Well,
he falls way too, at least in the drafts we do with people, he gets ignored for like a round longer than he should. Even in his heyday when he was like a mid-first rounder, okay, maybe he's like a mid-second rounder in a points league instead of a mid-first rounder, but he falls like the middle of the 3rd round, and it's like, wow, this is insane. Trey Turner, not in his prime anymore, 3.35 points per game last year. So again, another guy who was higher than Freddie Freeman. I'm going to keep picking on Freddie Freeman. Okay, how about this one? Trey Turner, 3.35 points per game last year. Corbin Carroll, 3.34.
Yeah, no,
I was the one who got Trey Turner, so I love it.
Yeah, like I don't think he should go much later in a head-to-head points league than a Roto league at this point. So any discount you get there, I think is welcome.
I will just to clarify, I do rank Trey Turner lower than both Freddie Freeman and certainly Corbin Carroll in this format. But the point is just he is closer to them than this him being drafted 30th overall, you said?
27th.
27th overall. He's closer to them than maybe that draft position would have you think.
It feels like there's a little Trey Turner hate this offseason. Just feels like he's going late, even in some of those NFBC drafts. And I get it. I mean, he's let people down the past couple of years. First year with the Phillies, not good. Dealt with injury this past season. So I get it. If he stays healthy, I still think he's an elite player. He showed that.
And I will just point out before he was a hamstring injury, right?
Yeah. He missed 6 weeks because of it or something like that.
Yeah. He missed from basically the start of May until the middle of June. Before the injury, he was on a 50 steal pace. I don't think he's going to be a 50 steal guy, but like still, I don't know, top 10 in sprint speed in the majors. Still showed that willingness to steal that much when he was healthy. And then he only stole 9 bases the rest of the way in 88 games. And I think people are looking at that, but like suffered a hamstring injury, stopped running as much. That's a tale as old as time. Mm-hmm. So I will say I wouldn't be stunned if Trey Turner had a 40 steal season.
One other name I wanted to point out in the second round, Matt Olson went 20th overall. He went 45th in our first mock draft. Is this just similar to Freeman? He just went earlier than he should have.
I think it's just the variance of Matt Olson, excuse me. I think there's just going to be a wide range of outcomes for Matt Olson in drafts this year.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see this particular outcome very often ahead of Bryce Harper. I can't really come up with a good justification for that. That was an argument we were having last year when Matt Olson was coming off the 54 homer season. So to still be having that argument this year, I don't think you're going to see that much.
Chris, to your point, the min and max pick on the NFBC for Matt Olson, 18 is the min pick. The max is 55. So
yeah. And you're probably not going to see gaps that big that often.
Want to move on to pitching here because that went earlier in this mock draft as well. And is that because it's head-to-head points and pitching typically goes a little earlier in this format? Or is that because pitching just went way too late in our first mock draft? Or maybe both?
I think it's more the former. Now, that is head-to-head points reputation as being a format that's friendlier for pitching. But I think it's applied the wrong way. And this is something I've been talking about for years, that it is also the more forgiving format for pitching, at least the way CBS standard scoring works, where you can make up for, like, you can stream pitchers, 2-star pitchers off the waiver wire easily and make up for not having a good pitching staff. You can kind of build a whole rotation off the waiver wire over the course of the season if you don't draft well at that position, because it's pitching production is so tied to volume, as we were talking about with Paul Skeens. Like you don't need necessarily the most dominant, highest end pitchers to have a successful pitching staff. So how I think you should apply the head-to-head points is better for pitchers. What's the word? That sort of
like a mantra
reputation. Yeah, the mantra is to really load up in the middle rounds on pitchers who you can feel confident, like have a full bench basically full of pitchers that you mix in based on matchups in 2-start weeks. And I just think that's a better formula for success. Wait to start drafting pitchers until all the stud hitters are gone, basically.
And that's more true in an era where nobody throws 200 innings too.
Yes.
Because it's a lot harder to rack up those 600 point seasons as a pitcher. And also in a head-to-head points league, this is a fairly small difference, but starting pitchers will make up probably a higher percentage of starting lineups in a head-to-head points league. It's probably like a 35 to 30% difference once you account for sparks throughout the season, but that also will inflate pitching at least a little bit.
Yeah. And to your point, Scott, about drafting elite hitters until there's none left and then just loading up on pitching.
Mm-hmm.
Head-to-head points leagues, they're shallower formats, right? There's no corner, there's no middle. There's 3 outfielders versus 5. There's 1 catcher versus 2. You need more hitters that stand out where you can,
Right.
When you're going head-to-head with your opponent, you need your hitters to kind of outperform theirs on a weekly basis, obviously. The best way to do that is to draft those early and then, kind of load up on
Especially
pitching.
Usually fewer lineup spots. You need to find how you're going to differentiate yourself from your opponent. And it's much easier to fake it at starting pitcher than it is at hitter. So because they're shallower, the mid-range of hitters, pretty interchangeable. And in fact, some of them are going to spill over into the waiver wire during the season. So the ones you can count on to differentiate your team are those early round true stud types. And by the way, I'll point out that this approach, I think, makes even more sense for this particular draft pool at starting pitcher. As I pointed out all off season, I don't see a whole lot of difference between number 15 in my rankings at starting pitcher and number 50. So there's a very large group of several dozen pitchers that to me have mid-high end potential. And you can get a lot of them even if you wait a long time at pitcher.
And one other point to belabor it slightly is you also you can control the edge you have at hitter. And you can't really do that at pitcher because if I've got a rotation with Zach Wheeler and Corbin Burns and Paul Skeens, and they're all making one start, and you've got like Tyler Anderson and Reed Detmers, and I don't know who's another similarly scrubby pitcher, Graham Ashcraft. If they all have 2-start weeks, your trio might outscore mine without actually pitching all that well. It's not likely, but that is another way that, like, if you have a big pitching edge, fairly often you won't in a head-to-head points league because 2-star weeks only come around, every 3 or 4 weeks per pitcher?
I feel like they are starting to be a little bit.
Oh, no, that's 100%.
Further.
Yeah, no, that was, I think I should save things. I saw something recently that I think most starts last year came with 5 days rest for the first time ever. It was like the highest percentage of starts came with 5 days rest than ever before in Major League Baseball. Like that is,
I'd believe it. Yeah.
Guys don't make 35 starts anymore. Like if you do the math on a 5-man rotation, it's like, oh yeah, you could make 32 starts at minimum. But if you balance, it's like, no, guys, like league leaders are around 31, 32 at most now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there are more 6-man rotations. Teams are just really smart about how they're spreading starting pitchers out too. It's how many times was Chris Sale in line for a 2-star week and it didn't happen, right? They were really good at stretching him out, and Ronaldo Lopez too. So, and we see that with the more relievers turn starters, I think teams don't really want to throw too much on those guys, and as a result, they're kind of spreading out that workload. So,
and like, I don't know, that 30% of the league now has like a recent Japanese starter also, and those guys never make a start on every 5th day. So like, yeah, that's also a big deal.
Did want to point out some of the big differences between that first draft and this one for some starting pitchers. So Garrett Crochet went 37th in this draft. He went 78th in the first one. Pablo Lopez 44th versus 74th. Blake Snell 46th versus 76th. And wait for this one. Jacob deGrom 36th versus 126th. So,
and the funny thing is that's the opposite of what it should be. Jacob deGrom should be going higher in a roto league than a points league.
Yeah.
Like that season where Jacob deGrom finished as a top 12 starter in 93 innings or whatever it was, that can't, like, definitionally cannot happen in a head-to-head points league. Yeah. So
dominant ratio guys who you don't trust the volume are better for roto and categories leagues. And that
Blake Snell.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I had a hard time wrapping my head around Jacob deGrom ahead of Chris Sale. I get regarding Chris Sale as an injury risk and downgrading him because of that, but feels like you should downgrade deGrom quite a bit more because of that, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Let's take our final break. When we return, we'll jump back into some picks that were also surprising. We'll do that right after this.
Historic rivals with unforgettable seasons meet in a game of honor. The Army-Navy game presented by USAA, December 14th on CBS.
Welcome back in, recapping our first head-to-head points mock draft of the offseason and some other surprising picks. Ryan Helsley, 35th overall. He was the second highest scoring reliever this year, but Emmanuel Clase went 53 picks later to be exact. So Ryan Helsley was just drafted too early, right?
I think the explanation here is probably a systemic one. We're drafting with a draft room that hasn't been fully updated for 2024 or 2025, excuse me. And so like guys aren't in the right order. The default still matters and impacts how. So like
I blame the Olsen pick on that, but
yeah, I don't know exactly what this one was, but I'm just putting it out there.
Helsley, having led the majors in saves last year, that it seems very intentional that the guy took Helsley first as the first reliever, but this is more, you get into format differences and you're in a 15-team roto league. Yeah. Closers are going to start going off the board as early as round 3 because of the scarcity that exists for saves. But you get into a head-to-head points league, it's opposite end of the spectrum because every team only has 2 relief pitcher spots to fill. And a lot of those are going to be filled by SPARPs. Relief eligible starting pitchers.
Well, at least some of them will be
enough that really only like 15 to 20 actual closers are being drafted, period. So most of the league, they were after my own heart and waiting as long as they possibly could in drafting relief pitcher. But there was that one guy who had to jump in there. And I think he won't be doing that next time he drafts in this format, at least not with us.
Yeah, and maybe we could say the same thing about Spencer Steer, who went 48th overall. Steer is a fine player at 2.9 fantasy points per game, but shouldn't go ahead of Pete Alonso and Corey Seager and Josh Naylor and guys like that. So could be part of the draft room, not fully updated yet, or maybe someone just really likes Spencer Steer. Maybe they're related. Who knows? Blake Snell. Wanted to ask you guys about Snell because I actually took him 47th overall as the SP12, just ahead of Framber Valdez, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, and Logan Webb.
I was surprised to see that, Frank.
I was surprised myself that I actually did it. You know what? I wanted to take hitters. I wanted to take more hitters early on. I started with 3 hitters. I wanted to keep doing that. When it got to the 4-5 turn, I just didn't really love the hitters that were there. You took Corey Seager in the 5th. I thought about that, but I didn't want to clog up my utility spot. So I was like,
that's what I ended up doing. Yeah, Seager, my second shortstop in round 5.
But yeah, you guys tell me, like, Blake Snell, 4th round pick, SP12 in a points league. Is that too early? It might be.
Look, I rank him even slightly higher than that, just among starting pitchers. But I don't want to draft my 12th, or I think in my case, 10th starting pitcher that early in a head-to-head points league. So I thought it was going to go like you guys have been saying when I tell you where I rank Blake Snell. Oh, you're going to get so much Blake Snell this year. And I got him I took him in the Roto League in what round?
Chris tells you that. I don't tell you. Okay. I kind of like Blake Snell too. So.
What round did I take him in the Roto League? 7 or something like that?
I think it was 6 or 7. Yeah.
And so then he goes in round 4 here. So I never had a chance at him. Mm-hmm. And yeah, just based on those conversations we've been having on the podcast, I was surprised you took him there. Chris made a good point earlier that volume is the big concern for Snell too. So I think if you're going to go the extra mile for him, it makes more sense in Roto. And so I don't know. I was surprised by the pick, Frank.
Yeah, so like
a little surprised myself.
Pablo Lopez has had a couple of decent seasons, but nothing spectacular. Certainly not on the level of like Blake Snell at his best. His last 2 seasons in this format, and he went a couple spots ahead of Blake Snell. His last 2 seasons in this format, 451 points last year, 484 the year before. Blake Snell's been in the majors for 9 years. One of them was his rookie year. Let's say 8. Let's call it 8 seasons. He's beat that twice. And it was the 2 years he won Cy Young. Like the problem with Blake Snell is he is far and away the least efficient good pitcher in baseball. great pitcher in baseball, let's say. He's reached 130 innings twice in a season. So like the upside for Blake Snell is he can get to that 500 point mark. He did that in 2023. The problem is that's the absolute ceiling for Blake Snell. And you got to think there's going to be a lot of Los Angeles.
Say that again, because your mic cut out for a second.
You got to think there's going to be a lot of 6-man rotation in LA. He never averages 6 innings per start. I literally think he has never averaged 6 innings per start. And so I can squint and see the case that Scott is making for Blake Snell in a roto league. I think it's too early in a points league.
Yeah, that's probably. I just want to point out
pretty close to his ceiling in a points league.
Let me explain then why I have Snell ranked as high as I do, even in points leagues, because particularly since they're a shallower format, particularly since you're going to be supplementing your rotation off the waiver wire a lot, at least the way I play, that's the case. It matters a lot less to me total number of points than what you can average per start, how impactful you can be during those stretches where I am absolutely going to start you. And Blake Snell, he had the groin injuries early on. He was doing his normal early season struggle thing through June, either on the IL or struggling. From July on, when he became good Blake Snell, 20.64 points per start, which was more than Tarek Skubal averaged on the year. So he was carrying your team, carrying your pitching staff for those final 3 months.
Right, but like 2023, I think maybe you disagree, but I think 2023 is like pretty close to like the best case scenario you could expect for Blake Snell for a full season.
Well, I was just doing 2024 though.
Right, no, but you were arbitrary endpointing it. I'm talking about a whole season. Because like a 20 points per game is like a peak Justin Verlander type season.
Yeah.
And
I'm saying that's how good Blake Snell is, but that's not when he becomes good Blake Snell.
Blake Snell's never done that for a full season.
No, but we're not asking.
Even like maybe back in 2018, but that's a whole different landscape ago. 2023, he averaged 15.9 points per game, which is really good. But it was like a rounding error better than Zach Eflin and Chris Bassett that year. And this is 2.25 ERA, 12, 13 K per 9, Cy Young winning Blake Snell. You know, like that's my thing. Like I get that like when he's locked in, he's as locked in as anyone. It's just he doesn't have the ability to rack up the volume over the course of the season the way even like a Zach Gallen.
So I think I'd be more hesitant, like if we were playing like in a deep 20 team head-to-head points league. I think where it's like, okay, these pitchers I'm drafting, I'm going to have to ride them through thick and thin. I'd be less inclined to pursue Blake Snell in that scenario. But we know the pattern Snell follows every year. And those of us who drafted him last year were able to lean on that and bench him until we knew when to start him, and it worked out perfectly. And I think we can keep applying that strategy to him going forward.
All right, we've got to move on.
I can just bench him is not a great argument for a guy being a top 12 starter, though.
We've got to move on. I just want to say, Chris, you compared him to Pablo Lopez. If you just look at the full season last year, Blake Snell averaged more fantasy points per game than Pablo Lopez.
Sure.
And to Scott's point, I was going to make the same one. If he does get hurt, you can, there's a better waiver wire in a league this shallow. So I guess you could replace him. But yeah, it's probably a little bit too early. I didn't love the pick at the time, but there was just nobody I really loved at that 4-5 turn. So I guess that's my excuse for drafting Blake Snell. Wanted to mention Roki Sasaki. He went 106th overall, right between Sonny Gray and Carlos Rodon. How does that sound as a landing spot for Roki Sasaki?
He'll never go that late again.
Yeah, his NFBC ADP in just December is 73.1.
Yeah, I think it's SP21. I don't know. Like we're so afraid of injuries unless you get hurt in the minors or in this case in Japan, and then we're like we don't know about injuries. Injuries don't matter. But Roki Sasaki has never pitched more than 130 innings in a season. He has made 44 starts, I think, combined over the past 2 seasons. He's dealt with arm, oblique, and elbow injuries. over the past 2 seasons and has thrown like 91 and 111 innings. And he's almost certainly going to be pitching every 6th day rather than every 5th day. So there'll be no 2-start weeks. I think he's being overdrafted anyway, but he's not going to be a target in a head-to-head points league for me.
All right, let's play a little game. We're going to focus on young, exciting hitters and their draft cost in this mock draft. Too high, too low, or just right. And we will start with Jackson Chourio, who went 22nd overall to me. Too high, too low, or just right in a points league?
Seems fine.
Too high. Maybe, what did you say he went? 22?
22nd, yeah.
I don't know that I am as so bothered by the number itself as just who he went ahead of.
Jared Duran.
Yeah, I mean, I ranked Duran ahead of him, and Duran went 8 spots later. I ranked Trey Turner ahead of him. I just think like those like tried and true studs. Maybe you couldn't say that for Duran, but certainly you could say that for Trey Turner.
Rafael Devers.
I'd want them all gone before I invested in the prospective stud, Jackson Chourio, who I think has stud potential. It may work out. I just would rather be a little more cautious when the alternative is so high end.
And I think the next player we're going to talk about is also a good example of why Jackson Chourio maybe went a little too early.
But what if I also got Trey Turner, Scott? Does that make it okay?
Yeah, you did. That's true.
So the next player is Jackson Merrill, who went 33rd overall, the 10th pick of the 3rd round. Too high, too low, or just right?
Too low. I rank him and Jackson Chourio back to back, and seeing them go 11 spots apart was surprising to me. And Jackson Chourio, like, what was his strikeout rate as a rookie last year? Like 17%. He could turn out to be a points league stud.
Yeah, that was my thinking as well. I'm like, he's going to take another step. This is fun.
The one surprising thing, Jackson Chourio walked more than Jackson Merrill. Jackson Merrill's walk rate was like 5%. It was really low. But even having said that, he was better than Jackson Chourio in this format last year. So, yeah.
What about Wyatt Langford? 57th overall, the middle of the 5th round. Too high, too low, or just right?
Maybe a little too high. Yeah.
Yeah. By about a round for me.
Yeah.
Okay. What about Junior Caminero?
Caminero!
So Junior Caminero went 61st overall. He also went 64th in that first mock. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Is he just going to go this high?
Well, in CBS mocks, apparently he went about 40 spots higher than NFBC ADP in both. And
which is surprising.
Compared to my own rankings, where do I have Caminero? I wonder if that song just ratcheted up the hype so much that now I stand no chance of getting. Yeah, I rank him 122.
Yeah, I've got him 100.
So maybe I'm a Caminero hater. I don't know.
Yeah, we have to rescind your song rights, Scott.
He went a spot ahead of Alex Bregman, who's always been a points league standout. Bregman didn't walk at his usual rate. His plate discipline numbers were a little off last year, so he wasn't as much of a standout, but he's still Alex Bregman, and you still expect him to be close to a stud in this format. So that seemed way too high for Caminero. Love the upside, but you gotta factor in downside too.
Next up, we have James Wood, who went 69th. Nice. Too high, too low, or just right?
Just right.
Chris?
He did walk a lot. I feel like it's probably too high, but I guess with the upside, if it clicks, it could be fine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, NFBC ADP for James Wood is 50, and that's a roto format. So getting almost a 20 pick discount in a points league. Yeah, I think that's probably just right for James Wood. What about Jordan Westberg, who went 75th overall? That is the beginning of the 7th round.
Just right. I have him 76th.
Yes. Chris?
I have not done full point rankings yet. It feels high.
No.
Doesn't have great plate discipline, especially doesn't walk much. But, you know, I can see like the fence being moved in being a bonus for him and pushing him somewhere to that range, but he's 89th in Roto and will be probably lower in points for me.
So I will point out Westberg had more points per game than both Marcus Semien and Ozzie Albies last year. Semien and Albies both underperformed. But to me, Westberg is a crystal clear number 5 at second base after the obvious top 4 of Marte, Altuve, Albies, and Semien. And those guys were all gone by the end of round 4, right? And so to wait 3 more rounds to get Westberg, I think that's appropriate. It doesn't seem like the consensus early on is with me on that. They put Westberg even further behind that top 4, but I don't know. I'm applying some position scarcity reasoning here.
He's going pretty close to Marcus Semien in NFC drafts. But that's because Marcus Semien is 30 spots behind Ozzie Albies in December, and Westberg is only 11 spots behind Marcus Semien.
So Semien's going too late too.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I think in early ADP, Semien probably is. Both mock drafts we've done, I've taken Jordan Westberg. I don't want to do this where I fall into, okay, I keep drafting a player early on, so then I just take that mindset into my rankings and real drafts, and I just keep taking that player. But I just feel like there's so much alike. He's a young player. He hits the ball hard. Expected stats were awesome. It's a great lineup around him. I'm pretty much in on Jordan Westberg for next season. Let's wrap up by taking a closer look at each of our teams and our builds and some of our strategy, what we were thinking along the way. And we will start with Scott's team, who is drafting 6th in this one. And Scott, you started your team with 6 hitters in a row.
Yeah, baby.
Bobby Witt Jr., Vlad Guerrero Jr., Jarren Duran, Jose Altuve, Corey Seager, and Christian Yelich. Is this how you envision most of your drafts going in 2025?
Yes. Now, this is the furthest I'll probably take it, 6 rounds. And if I did that in a deep league, like a 15-teamer, that's probably not a good idea. But I basically followed the mantra of keep drafting hitters until all the studs are gone. You could question whether my 6th pick, Christian Yelich, is a stud. He certainly was for the time he was healthy last year. I mean, this is his better format, as good as his plate discipline is. 3.78 points per game last year. Jordan Alvarez, for instance, was 3.61. Mookie Betts was 3.75. So on a per game basis, Yelich outperformed both of them. He's coming back from back injury. That creates all kinds of question marks, but I think round 6 is, particularly for this format, enough of a discount to kind of mitigate those risks. I had hoped not to take Yelich there. I'd hoped to wait maybe another round, and in round 6, sneak in. Who was it? Oh, it was actually. Oh, no, was it him? It was a pitcher. It was like Michael King, maybe. I don't know. He ended up going before my pick came up, so I took Yelich instead. And waited another round to take my first pitcher. If Chris Sale had fallen to, where did he end up going? Chris Sale ended up going early in round 4. I was thinking about taking him. My pick was up 5 spots later. I ended up taking Jose Altuve. But if Chris Sale had made it to me in the middle of round 4, I would have been tempted to do that. So it's not like I absolutely won't take a pitcher in the first 5 or 6 rounds, but the value kind of has to be screaming at me to do it.
And speaking of those pitchers, you started with 6 hitters in a row, and then you took 5 pitchers in a row after that. You took Luis Castillo, Bailey Ober, Spencer Strider, Joe Ryan, and Kodai Senga. You sniped me a few times. I was looking at Bailey Ober. I was looking at Joe Ryan. So I didn't love that, Scott, but this is what you were talking about, where from SP 15 to 50, just kind of hammering it in the middle.
Load up, get as many as I can, because I don't have a lot of preferences within that range. I have slight preferences. I think Michael King is my 14th pitcher. I just set him apart. So I do put him a little ahead of that 15 to 50 group, and why I was going to take him potentially if he lasted to me in round 6. But yeah, once we got into that 15 to 50 group, it's like, okay, I'll just take whoever my top ranked one is when my pick comes up, and I'll just keep taking them until we get to 50 and they're all gone, and then I'll see how hitter looks. It's not going to play out that perfectly in every draft. It just happened to in this one. You know, there will be times when top 5, 6 rounds, I mix in a pitcher, maybe even 2 pitchers. That middle range of the draft, I'll maybe grab a hitter. More likely in Roto where there's a lot more hitter spots to fill. But in this format where there's only the 9 hitter spots to fill, I don't care what hitters they are if they're not studs. So once the stud hitters were gone, give me pitchers until there's a clear drop off at pitcher.
All right, let's move over to Chris's team. He was drafting 8th in this one, and you started your draft with 4 hitters in a row: Gunnar Henderson, Yordan Alvarez, Austin Riley, and William Contreras. How did you feel, I guess at the time, like how convicted were you to take the first catcher off the board? And as the draft went along, did you find yourself regretting it at any point?
I think you look at the whole thing, and let me see who I could have taken instead of William Contreras, because he is one of, I don't know, is he the only catcher who has a realistic chance to get to like 500 points?
I could see Adley Rutschman in a best case scenario
because of his plate discipline.
But obviously there was a big difference between the two last year.
Yeah, I could see, like, I don't know, like that's kind of the thing though. You look at the guys who went after him, and it feels like that's when you start to see a little bit of a drop off at the other. But like, I guess Kyle Schwarber, but DH only feels especially limiting in a points league. So that's always tough. Altuve, Semien, I don't know, feels a little early. I would have taken Seager the next time around, but probably not in the 4th round. So I don't know. I feel okay about it. You know, we talk about you want every position spot to be as big of an edge as it can be. Well, William Contreras certainly is that. It's just there are a couple other spots, particularly first base, where I didn't really get an edge. And so, you know, I don't know who the next first baseman taken.
It was Pete Alonso, actually.
Yeah.
Would you do that different? Like, take Pete Alonso 4th round instead of William Contreras, and then just take whatever catcher when you got Ryan Mountcastle?
Yeah, that might have been a better option. I don't know.
I'll confess.
I'm a little worried about Pete Alonso, honestly.
Your William Contreras in the middle of round 4 pick was the one that frustrated me the most as the draft was playing.
Oh, good. I love it.
Because I was up in 2 picks and I had him queued up.
Ooh.
I was like, I'll take that big advantage at catcher.
Spicy.
And you took him. So I settled for Jose Altuve, but it did feel like a settling situation. I don't know how my second base would have turned out if I hadn't taken Altuve. Maybe I would have ended up regretting taking William Contreras if it had happened. But I do think round 4 is the right time to do that, particularly in a small lineup format like this where you need as many advantages as you can get.
I think my biggest problem is just that I waited too long for that first baseman. It's less the William Contreras part and more that I just got a potential nothing at first. Like Mountcastle, if he stays in Baltimore, moving the fences in, that could help him, but that feels especially bad.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that you took Bo Bichette, who you like, as your utility hitter, and the very next pick after that was Luis Ariz, who has first base eligibility. If you can kind of swap those two and give yourself a better first baseman.
No, because like Luis Ariz, I think the best case scenario is like 450 points is probably the absolute ceiling for a guy that just doesn't walk, doesn't produce runs, doesn't hit homers. Bichette, we have seen a 500-point season from him before. I'm not necessarily saying he will get back to that, but we've also seen a 470-point season from him. So Bo Bichette is, I think, very clear of Luis Ariz for me.
Mm-hmm.
Ariz as a 354 hitter in 2023, who played 147 games, so he missed a little bit, but 435 is what he scored. So yeah, I would say 450, the absolute best case scenario for him, and that comes out to like
probably right around 3 points per game.
Yeah, just a little under probably. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Chris, you started your draft with 4 hitters in a row. After that, 4 of your next 5 picks were pitchers. You took Garrett Cole, Max Fried.
Big Yankees fan here.
I know I was going to point that out. Justin Steele and Grayson Rodriguez. Were you pleased with, waiting on pitching a little bit and then winding up with this top 4?
Not really.
It looks pretty good to me.
It looks good. It just, that is a lot of injury risk.
Scroll down to it, Frank. I can't.
Oh, right. I should probably do that.
Yeah.
There you go.
We've got the visuals here. That's why you should watch us on YouTube.
Yeah, all of those guys have, I think, that 500 point upside. We haven't. Grayson Rodriguez is the one we have not seen it really anywhere close from him. Obviously, Garrett Cole, we've seen 600 point seasons. Fried has gotten to 500. Steele came very, very close. And I think 500 is 500 is the true difference makers, 500 and above in that range. So that's always what I'm looking for. But obviously, Cole, Fried, and Steele Cole, Fried, and Rodriguez, have missed time with upper body, arm, or connected to the arm injuries. So I wish I had more sure things given what I invested in it. But when I look at the offense, first base is really the only place I don't feel good about. So I don't know. I think it's okay.
Yeah, everything else looks good. You've got William Contreras, Mountcastle, Bogarts, Austin Riley, Gunnar Henderson, Yordan Alvarez, Michael Harris, Seiya Suzuki, and Bo Bichette. So it's really just first base and shallow league. Maybe you find one along the way, something like that.
That would be the hope. It's also partially, I think, reflecting that first base is just pretty bad right now.
Yeah. Let's wrap up with a quick look at my team. I was drafting 3rd in this one, and I started 3 hitters in a row: Aaron Judge, Jack Centurio, and Trey Turner. Like I mentioned, I wanted to take Jarren Duran in the 3rd. I didn't want to start my team off with 3 outfielders. I actually wanted to keep drafting hitters, but again, there was no one I really loved at that 4-5 turn. Yeah, there was Pete Alonso, Marcus Semien, Teoscar Hernandez. I like Corey Seager, but didn't want to.
Either of the Texas guys would have been the pick.
Yeah, I didn't want to plug my utility early, and I was able to get Marcelo Ozuna at the 6-7 turn. And
that's great.
We talked this
that was one of the best.
Those util hitters, they're just such good values. I just didn't want to plug it early on.
Yeah, no, I mean, Marcelo Ozuna, late 6 is great value. I took Christian Yelich mid 6. I would have rather taken Yelich, but I'd already filled utility with Corey Seager around earlier, which I don't necessarily regret, but that's the downside. You can't take advantage of that Ozuna pick when he's last to the end of round 6.
In terms of pitching, I went with a little bit more of a mixed approach, kind of spreading it out a little bit. At the 4-5 turn, I took Blake Snell and George Kirby. Then I took Spencer Schwellenbach in the 8th round. I took Tanner Bybee in the 10th and Brian Wu in the 11th. I like it. I don't love it.
I like it more in Roto.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those.
I think sometimes it's kind of difficult for me to kind of rewire and go back and forth. And sometimes I draft players I like in Roto and points leagues just because I feel like they've fallen too far. But yeah, it probably is a better rotation for Roto.
You could absolutely make it work, though.
Oh, yeah.
In a league this shallow.
Yeah.
And you've got some really interesting names on your bench. You've got at least one very interesting spark. So that helps also.
I like your pitching staff's fine. It's not like I look at your pitching staff and say, oh, this is a huge weakness for this team. It's definitely workable. And then I look at your starting lineup and, I'm the one who spent first 6 picks on hitters. And yet I look at your starting lineup and it looks like there are fewer holes than mine has. You do have Mark Vientos at 3rd base. Could work out, but it's a little shaky. But I have Matt Chapman at 3rd base. And meanwhile, you have Real Muto at catcher versus my Gabriel Moreno. My 3rd outfielder. Yours is Stephen Kwan, which is a great points league option. Mine is Dylan Cruz.
Yep.
A lot of upside, but may not be ready to really live up to it yet. So your lineup looks most plug and play, even more than mine does for not going quite as extreme with the hitter heavy approach early.
All right. Well, if anyone wants to check out all of our teams, all the picks, whatever rounds you want to see, again, the results are live on the site. I'll put the link in the podcast and YouTube description if you want to check that out. We are going to wrap there. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning in to Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. And we will be back again next week. Bye-bye.